Life of a plurilingual is somewhat unpredictable, improvised, uneven, but exciting. It does not usually follow a linear historical trajectory where all the pieces fit together like a prefabricated puzzle. No, actually, it's quite the opposite. It's just like a treacherous winding road where you are unsure about what you encounter around the corner, but when you finally get to your destination, everything will make sense. You must be wondering, what is all this supposed to mean? Let me start by telling the story of a plurilingual girl called Angelica. Angelica was born in a suburban town called Ribeirão Pires, located in the southeast of Brazil. Brazil with an S. It's not a typo. That's how it's spelled in Portuguese. I mean, Brazilian Portuguese. Wait, what's the difference between Brazilian Portuguese and Portuguese Portuguese? Isn't it the same language? Yeah, it is one language, but in post-colonial Brazil, some like to differentiate between the two as a way to affirm their identity, or to make a point that they are not a Portuguese colony anymore. It's certainly a political and ideological statement. As you know, the Portuguese discovered or invaded Brazil in the year 1500. Portuguese became the most powerful language in the country. I mean, we now call it Brazilian Portuguese. I'm sorry, I guess I'm sidetracking. Let's go back to Angelica's story. Both her parents were born in Brazil, but they came from different linguistic backgrounds. Angelica's father was from Italy, and her mother's family was from Spain. In the 1900s, many European immigrants went to Brazil to work in the coffee plantations, mainly the Italians. The Spanish also immigrated there in search of a better economic opportunity. This fact influenced the way Angelica would grow as a plurilingual, even though she had no idea what a plurilingual was. And if you too don't know what a plurilingual is, no worries. You have it all figured out by the end of the story. Angelica was still a toddler when she started learning to speak Brazilian Portuguese. Her first words were obviously mamãe and papai, as she didn't yet have a choice of which words or languages to learn. In fact, her parents taught her to say those two words in Italian and Spanish too. However, when she would say mama and papa in Italian or mama and papa in Spanish, she didn't know she was speaking different languages. If you have noticed these three languages are similar, this is not mere coincidence. Portuguese, Italian, and Spanish come from the same language family. They are Romance languages. Angelica had no idea she was speaking three different languages. For her, all those words were interconnected and part of what we call linguistic repertoire. Some people naively believe that each language a person learns is stored in a little box in their head and they are all separated from each other. If they had followed Angelica's linguistic development, they would have to conceptualize a different theory. In her mind, she would use one language or another interchangeably, and that for her was fun. She would even invent new words. Once, her mother gave her a laranja, and she immediately decided to call it Zaza. Her mother kept saying, "It's not Zaza, it's laranja," but Angelica would ignore her mother's corrections. Zaza to her was a better word to represent her favorite fruit. This freedom to invent linguistic items was allowed until Angelica started attending preschool, when she felt she had to conform to using one language only. In her first week of school, Angelica's teacher, Professora Ana, bluntly told her she had a speech problem. She didn't know how to pronounce some phonological sounds, such as the s in sapato. Instead, she would use the th and would pronounce sapato. Professora Ana promptly called Angelica's mother in for a meeting to discuss her language learning deficit. Professora Ana told Angelica's mother that Angelica probably had a low IQ because she was unable to learn some sounds of Brazilian Portuguese. Of course, Angelica's mother believed in Professora Ana and quickly had Angelica's IQ tested. The fact is, Angelica knew very well how to pronounce the s, as she would accurately say sandália. instead of sandália. What might have happened is that Angelica's older sister was learning English at school, and she had taught Angelica how to say obrigada in English, thank you. Angelica was still in the playful mode, using the sounds of different languages that she had had contact with. She was still a child, and that is normal at the developmental stage. It turned out that Angelica's IQ test was not below the level of normal development. She was a normal child. After a few years immersed in Brazilian Portuguese at school, Angelica started to be unwilling about learning in general. Unable to experiment with other languages, she would constantly feel as if she were in a trap, not being able to expand her horizons. She still felt the need to express herself in other languages. Angelica would still use a few words in Italian and in Spanish at home, but she felt suppressed when she was at school. Finally, in grade 5, she was introduced to her first formal learning of a foreign language, English. All of a sudden, Angelica became interested in studying again, and she was excited about learning the language her sister had already introduced to her. What Angelica hadn't realized at the time was that Brazil, being surrounded by Spanish-speaking countries, chose the instruction of a foreign language that did not meet the geographical needs to communicate with its neighbors. Of course, English at that time was considered the language of success, business, and knowledge. There is no doubt that this idea still prevails. English is still a powerful language. What is fascinating about the spread of English around the world nowadays is that people from diverse language backgrounds are appropriating English to voice their needs to the world. However, the political decision of introducing English to the school curriculum in Brazil and in many other countries supports and maintains the power of English has. Certainly, this educational policy shaped Angelica's plurilingual trajectory. Given that no other foreign language at the time was offered at public schools and that Brazil was being inundated by the constant exposure to North American media, English became a prominent language in the country. There is no doubt that North American music, MTV, and Hollywood movies supported Angelica's development of English. At that time, her favorite band was the New Kids on the Block, a boys' band from Boston. She would listen to their music all day, every day, memorizing the lyrics of the songs and looking up words in a bilingual dictionary. She would turn her family crazy, especially her sister, who loved heavy metal at the time. She would also rent videotapes with North American movies and would play them in her VCR. But because the videos had subtitles in Portuguese, she would tape her TV so she didn't have to read the subtitles, enabling her to focus on listening only. Her mother would always make her clean the glue off the TV later. Angelica was so motivated to learn English that she invested all her free time practicing it. Her parents were so proud to know she was interested in school again that they decided to give her what she had been asking for, a Walkman. A Walkman was a device where we could put tapes in it to listen to audio recordings, mainly music. But music for Angelica was learning languages, especially English at the time. Her English textbook used in her school accompanied tapes so students could practice listening and pronunciation. Angelica would listen to her tapes all day, mimicking what the English speaker said. Angelica's Walkman was her best friend. Her mother started to worry about Angelica as she would do nothing else but listen to her tapes. Irritated, she once went into her room and asked, "Por que você fica ouvindo essa fita toda hora?" Angelica simply replied, "I don't know. It's fun." Years and years went by, and Angelica was dedicated to learning only English. As a result, Italian and Spanish, although still stored in her mind, were spoken less and less and became dormant. She knew she would soon need to pass an English test to enter university, so she invested more and more in that language. Acceptance to a university was dependent on your score. The higher the score, the easier access to education. At that time, university entrance tests didn't offer any other choice of foreign language. Because Angelica's English was good, she passed the exam. During her university years, Angelica lived in São Paulo, a megalopolis with 12 million people. Her trip to university was just like an adventure. She would walk through São Paulo's hustle and bustle, take an overcrowded bus, and the fastest transit 3 million people a day choose to take, the subway. She would always get off at a charming station called Anhangabaú. After looking that word up in a Brazilian Portuguese dictionary, Angelica found out that word was a word in Tupi-Guarani, one of the many indigenous languages in Brazil. Anhangabaú means Águas dos Espíritos Diabólicos. Naturally, Angelica's fascination towards languages motivated her to know more about Tupi-Guarani. After going to her university library, she found a book called Método Moderno de Tupi Antigo by Eduardo de Almeida Navarro. After carrying this book around, a colleague of hers asked her if she was taking Navarro's course. Angelica had no idea the author of the book was teaching a course in Tupi. In her second term, she enrolled in the Tupi-Guarani course. Angelica's university years were linguistically fruitful and brought her back to a deeper exploration of a plurality of languages she already had in her repertoire, with the addition of a few other languages. She took Spanish, Italian, Sanskrit, Latin, Japanese, Esperanto, and of course, English, her main major. The fact that her Spanish had been dormant for many years didn't impede her to redevelop it quickly, especially with the help of a few trips she took around South America. She was glad that, although she hadn't studied Spanish in her early school years, she was finally able to study the language of the neighboring countries. She invited her mother to accompany her journey to Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina, and they would both engage in conversations with the local people in each country. Angelica and her mother loved South American culture, festivities, rituals, la música, and la comida. Until now, they both maintained the language by talking to each other in Spanish whenever possible. At home, she continued to revitalize some of the languages she had left aside while studying English. She would use some expressions in Italian, mainly with her father. As her older sister had married a man who was a Nisei, or a second generation of Japanese born, she would also speak a few words in Japanese. Angelica's heavy metal sister became an indigenous researcher, and they could bond speaking a few words in Tupi-Guarani with each other. In her social circle, she had friends who had immigrated to Brazil from Bolivia, Japan, and Germany. She had never learned German at school or university, but because of her previous linguistic experience, she didn't hesitate to learn a few words. Angelica is no longer a girl. She's a grown woman. Nowadays, she's based in Toronto and lives with her partner who's Canadian. He speaks English and French, the two official languages in Canada, and learned some Portuguese words from his school friends who had immigrated to Canada from Açores, Portugal. Angelica and her partner enjoy talking to each other in different varieties of Portuguese. Learning different varieties of the same language is another aspect of a plurilingual. Oh, that reminds me, the purpose of this story is to explain what a plurilingual is. Angelica calls herself plurilingual because her life trajectory provided her with the opportunity to learn several languages, or varieties within the same language. Obviously, she's not able to speak them all very well. Her proficiency in her linguistic repertoire is constantly fluctuating. For example, at a point in her life she spoke Spanish fluently. Other times, she had to leave it aside and learn English for academic and professional purposes. This is not really a problem. It's part of the process of language development of a plurilingual. Most importantly, as a plurilingual, Angelica feels empowered to be able to activate this repertoire according to the needs of her social, personal, or professional life. Having a rich linguistic resource has given Angelica a sense of understanding the world through its people and cultures. She feels that speaking other languages minimizes the gap between one culture and the other, bringing her closer to whoever she has contact with. Nowadays, Angelica teaches English to speakers of other languages. She feels privileged to have a huge linguistic diversity in her own classroom, and she can activate her linguistic resources on a daily basis. As a plurilingual teacher, she ensures to acknowledge and validate her students' linguistic backgrounds and encourages them to learn each other's languages. They can access their faculté du langage, that is, they can draw upon the knowledge of languages they already know to learn other languages. After all, languages should not be seen as separated. Rather, they complement each other. Not to mention that a plurilingual person is more likely to respect, understand, and appreciate other cultures. Angelica's life trajectory has shaped her as a plurilingual she is today, but her journey will continue. Each one of us has had contact with other languages or varieties within the same language. We all have a linguistic repertoire. We are all plurilingual. What's your plurilingual story?